weekend of the event. Without further ado, I am honored to introduce the first panelist of the evening, UN Special Rapporteur, Ms. Mary Lawler. Since May 2020, Ms. Lawler has been the current UN Special Procedures Mandate holder for the situation on human rights defenders. Ms. Lawler is a widely respected and renowned leader in the international human rights movement, serving as the director of the Irish section of Amnesty International from 1988 to 2000. In 2001, she established and became executive director of Frontline Defenders, which went on to receive the illustrious UN Prize in the field of human rights in 2018. Just last week, Ms. Lawler made her first appearance at the 46th session of the UN Human Rights Council to introduce her report as Special Rapporteur, highlighting the killings of human rights defenders and the threats that often precede them. Ms. Lawler, we are delighted to have you on our panel, and the first questions of the evening are directed to you. What trends does your mandate identify when it comes to the prosecution of human rights defenders, especially women's rights defenders, in Saudi Arabia? Ms. Lawler, you are muted.
Okay, sorry, it told me I couldn't unmute myself.
Oh, I see, thank you.
And then the host did it. Well, first of all, I want to say thank you very much for having me here, and it is a joy for me to be here on International Women's Day, and to remember all the brave women human rights defenders around the world who are intimidated, threatened, smeared, attacked, and killed. And as you rightly pointed out, I presented my first report to the Council on Friday and today for the interactive dialogue. It may come as a shock to you to know that over 1,232 human rights defenders have been killed, including 38 women in 64 countries between 2015 and 2019. And 281 in 2019, just alone, including 38 human rights defenders. I mean, these are shocking statistics, and I think we have to be really careful, because the killing of human rights defenders should be a red line. Now, when it comes to Saudi Arabia, it's a very, very difficult place. You don't need me to tell you that. In fact, I'm here to listen to the other panelists. But it's a very, very difficult place for women human rights defenders, as the mandate on human rights defenders has detailed for many years. Defenders are criminalized and jailed, banned from leaving the country, as you alluded to a few minutes ago about Lujain. Saudi also sentences human rights defenders to very long terms imprisonment, and the report on long-term imprisonment of human rights defenders is one that I'll be doing for my next report to the UN General Assembly. And this usually often takes place in the context of allegations of subversion or terrorism or something like that. But Saudi is a country, as you know, whereby human rights defenders can be sentenced to very long terms imprisonment. So anyone that has information on human rights defenders subject to 10 years or more imprisonment, please go to the questionnaire on the website of the the mandate website, and give in a submission. So I mean, the situation is very grave, as I said, and it is particularly grave because it's in a context where it is so difficult for women human rights defenders to assert their rights, because they know full well that any kind of campaigning for their rights as women will lead to very, very terrible sanctions. So I think I'll leave it at that now, just for the moment.
Thank you, Ms. Lawler. In the report which you presented last week at the 46th Human Rights Council session, you did point out that impunity is one of the main drivers behind killings of human rights defenders. Does your mandate recognize impunity as playing a key role in the detention and killings of women's rights offenders in Saudi Arabia?
I'm afraid impunity is a key driver for so many attacks against women human rights defenders all over the world, including Saudi Arabia. The real problem is that nobody takes impunity seriously. Nobody investigates serious threats, and often serious threats can escalate, and a human rights defender can be set up to be killed. Not set up to be killed, but the environment can be created whereby a defender can be killed. But since the mandate started 20 years ago, there have been over 30 recommendations from previous mandate holders on the issue of impunity, which is a colossal problem all around the world. And really, it just gets down to one thing. There is no political will to properly address impunity against threats, attacks, and killings against human rights defenders, or indeed to look at detention of peaceful women who are just advocating for the rights of women, and are kind of jailed on these spurious law charges, just to keep them quiet, shut them up, and prevent them from doing their work, and act as a deterrent to other women not to be involved in human rights work.
Thank you very much, Ms. Lawler. Is there anything you would like to add before I give the floor to Julia?
Well, just on the criminalization, I mean, there's a lot of laws that are being used against women human rights defenders, well, all human rights defenders in Saudi, but including women. For instance, the anti-cybercrime law, which has been used against some women human rights defenders, which punishes the transmission of material deemed to impinge on public order and carries a sentence of up to 5 years in prison. And the authorities said that the defenders, you know, they communicate with people and entities hostile to the king. But as I said, specific laws aren't really the issues. You know, any state that is hell-bent on prosecuting and criminalizing legitimate work of human rights defenders in accordance with the UN Declaration on Human Rights Defenders, which was adopted in 1998 after 13 years negotiation, and to which all states agreed. It was a consensus resolution, but they will find spurious charges, as I said, and they will use them to jail anyone that they see as a threat. And very often, it's you see that repression is often a measure of their effectiveness. You know, the fact that they feel they have to repress and prosecute and attack women human rights defenders, it means they're making a difference. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Lawler, for your knowledgeable input on a clearly multifaceted situation, and we look forward to further interventions from you throughout the evening. I would like to now hand the floor over to my collaborator, Julia from Al-Quds, to introduce our next panelist. Julia, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Julie, and a warm welcome to everyone again. We're really happy to be able to facilitate that important conversation today. And it's my great honor to introduce our next guest, Hala Dosari. Hala is a very well-known Saudi human rights and women's rights activist. She's been a strong supporter of women's rights in Saudi Arabia for many years, but Hala is also an academic and a writer. She holds a PhD in health services research from the Old Dominion University, with her research concentrating on the epidemiology of violence against women and its adverse health outcomes in Saudi Arabia. Welcome, Hala. It's great to have you with us. I would like to talk to you. I think Mary Lawler picked up on that or touched upon the legal framework. I mean, we know that Saudi Arabia criminalizes the formation of critical human rights groups and prosecutes individuals for demanding political and human rights reform, including calls for gender equality. So could you elaborate again for us on which national laws impede the protection of women and women human rights defenders, or if there are any laws that protect women, then what is the discrepancy between the laws and the implementation of the laws in the country? Hala, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Julia, and the Gulf Center for the Bahrain Center for Human Rights for having me. This is very much like embedded in the structural system in Saudi Arabia, the discrimination against human rights defenders in general and women's rights defenders in particular is very much embedded in most of the national law and most of the practices. Even if the law mandates, for instance, certain protection for people who are prosecuted according to the criminal procedural law, it is not ever followed. And the situation of the women's rights activists who were targeted and arrested, left without trials or charges for over 9 months, some of them are more, for 3 years, without trials or referral to trials. And those who were released are on probation, very much in violation of the written law and in violation of the commitments of Saudi Arabia to the CEDAW agreement. In particular, there are some of the laws inside Saudi Arabia that views or actually describes activism or women's rights activism as a form of terror or as a form of criminality. Like the criminal procedural law that I've just mentioned, the criminal procedural law actually dictates certain crimes that warrant an immediate detention. Although they are not specifically saying that these crimes include engagement in campaigns and promotion of women's rights, meeting journalists, or working in transnational networks with the human rights organizations or with the UN, giving testimonies or engaging in any kinds of activities that highlights and exposes discrimination against women in the country. But it says that there is actually one of the crimes listed as any crime stated by Wali al-Amr or the ruler, basically. So any kinds of memorandum sent against any women human rights defender, as what happened with the women activists, to the general prosecution is considered a crime that warrants detention. There is also two main laws that are used against activists in general and women's rights activists that was very much listed in the charges of the general prosecution against most of the women activists. And these are the cybersecurity law, using the internet to promote ideas that destabilizes the country, that very much incites sedition, very much vague terms, broad terms that are not specific to a particular act, but used as a catch-all phrases. Also the counterterrorism law, which is used as, as a way to very much criminalize the acts of activism inside Saudi Arabia. So the counterterrorism law states broadly those kinds of action as action that would destabilize the country, that would harm the reputation of the state, things like that, which are not really very definitive or very specific, are used often to demand very lengthy sentences or demand that those human rights activists or women's rights activists to be treated as terrorists, basically. There are also a number of royal decrees and ministerial decisions by the Minister of Interior and by the Royal Court that also criminalize any kinds of independent promotion of certain opinions or certain ideas, including those of feminism. We have seen for sure that feminism has been treated as in the state media. And of course, in Saudi Arabia, most of the online activities, most of the news are very much controlled by the state. We have seen a move since the arrests of the women activists to portray feminism or promotion of women's rights activists as one of the radical thoughts that equates with terrorism or radical basically Islamic terrorism. There is also the association, of course, just to reiterate on the media role, there was also a smear campaign that has been ongoing since the arrest of the women activists that posted their pictures along with the word traitors in the front pages of the national news before their interrogation, before any charges were formally presented against the women in the first few days of their arrest. And the arrests, of course, happened in ways that contradicted the existent law of the criminal procedural law. There was no summon to the women. There was, the raids on their homes. There was no charges presented or court order presented to the women. Very much like, like an immediate raids on their home. So again, the association law is fairly new law that came after the civil society and the international community have called on Saudi Arabia to issue some kinds of regulations to allow the independent or the civil society or independent people to be engaged in community work and in civil society activities. When the association law came, it was very much strange that it just enforces the practiced, norms of the Saudi government, in which the Minister of the Social Affairs, or the authorities basically, or the Islamic Affairs, both of them are entitled to reject any order for the application submitted from any kinds of groups or civil society to operate any kinds of independent civil society. In the case of the women activists, for the last few years, they were mobilizing and lobbying to start a shelter for women. Shelters in Saudi Arabia, as many have recognized, shelters for survivors of violence do not allow women to come with their children, do not allow foreign women living in the country to access shelters. They do not provide comprehensive services, and they often end up giving the women to the abusers after the abuser sign, which always, a practice, after he signs a pledge of not harming the women anymore. So women activists lobbied to have this shelter established in which women would have full freedom and also protection. They would have legal counseling. They can bring their own children. Even if they were foreigners, they could also have access to the shelters. Many of the reputable community figures supported the women, a lawyer and a businessman whose names appeared with the women in the Spear campaign as traitors because of the association with the women. And of course, it turns out at the end that their application has never been permitted or approved by the country. So in practice, or in testing those kinds of reforms, which is again the same that we've experienced even before the law, that women who have been coming together to mobilize for more reforms, like women coming under Baladi campaign to increase the women representation in municipal election, which happened for the first time in 2015. They've organized the nationwide campaign called Baladi, all by individual efforts, only to be stopped by the Ministry of Interior. And they were told that only Ministry of Interior and its sanctioned organizations are allowed to promote ministerial engagement, or basically women engagement in municipal elections. So we've seen that before, and it's continuing. So reforms have not actually allowed women activists, excluded actually women activists or women who have been very much community leaders and mobilizers from having any kinds of role in those kinds of reforms. So I would say it's very much embedded in most of the laws and regulation within Saudi Arabia, and the case of the women activists who were arrested have somehow manifested and demonstrated this type of repression and exclusion of the voices of these women from any kinds of written reforms or laws or regulations.
Thank you very much for giving us such a comprehensive overview of the legal framework, and for painting, well, a rather grim picture, I would say, of laws that discriminate against women, or that are kept so general that they can really qualify any acts of peaceful activism as terrorism or sort of offense of national unity. Unfortunately, Lina is not with us today, but I'm sure that you're just as qualified to answer that question, and you've already touched upon it. In fact, the smear campaigns that were led against the women human rights defenders would lead me to ask you, what do you think are the prospects of those women that have now been released, like Lujain al-Hathloul, but also the others that have been temporarily released and are facing restrictions such as probation or travel bans? Like, what are their prospects to reintegrate into society? Sorry, Hala, you're muted again.
Sorry, it's not from my side. Somebody's unmuting me. All right. So basically, honestly, we didn't expect the women to be released. We, at the beginning with the smear campaign, they were actually posting those kinds of legal opinion on the discussion of the case in the media, in the Saudi media, stating that women either are faced with death penalty or with 20 years or basically a life sentence. So it was a very grim picture at the beginning. It's only because of the support of the international community, the women, organizations across the globe, the diplomats who engaged in this kind of cause, that we have seen some progress. And it's not very much surprising that immediately after the election of President Biden, that we've seen some kinds of movement in the cases of the women. It just tells so much about the effect of the international pressure, the international intervention in cases of the protection of human rights and the solidarity, outcomes that really would protect those people everywhere. So, for instance, those who were released even before Loujain, we had a group of women who were released before Loujain, 1 year before Loujain was released. They were banned from travel as well, very much indefinitely. So we don't know when are they going to be, allowed to travel again. They were suspended from resuming their activity. Many of them are having posts in universities. They were told not to come to their jobs anymore. Many of them are very much shunned by the state, under constant monitoring. Those who were interrogated are kept on an interrogation basis. So they are, we hear news of some of them being summoned again for interrogation. Many of them are people who were silent for years, so it's very much suspicious. It just meant to keep them under check, a constant check basically from the state, that they're not anyway able to feel a sense of security enough to talk about their ordeal and to express what happened to them. It is only through the courage of Loujain Hadloul family and some of the other families that we've learned about the horrific actions committed against, those women by the Presidency of State Security. The Presidency of State Security is an overarching, entity that was, created by the Royal Court after Mohammed bin Salman came to power, that has the authority to trespass any kinds of institutions or law, and has been involved in the killing of Khashoggi, whether it's in extra-territorial operations or in the most heinous acts against people inside the Saudi prisons, like the torture and the killings. So basically, we've seen that the Presidency of State Security, even with the women who are released or who are with the women who are still in prisons, are actually filtering their communication with their own families or with the community in general, very much censoring the letters, the requests that they are sending to different institutions. Down institutions have published a profile of one of the officers in the Presidency of State Security called Salah al-Jataili, who has a very much like hands-on involvement in the case of Loujain al-Hadloul, preventing the torture details to be released to different state institutions, or to in communication or letters communication with her own family. And of course, we've seen that their lives is very much like in very much like stopped, basically, let alone their activism, let alone their advocacy and the position that they had in Saudi Arabia. This is very much unfortunate, because these women did not only provide a bridge to the international community where they can share experience and knowledge and build capacity to change, the restrictions imposed on women, but also for the women within Saudi Arabia who cannot find redress, who cannot find resources within their own community. They actually resorted to these women, to the community figures, to the, budding network that they've developed in order to amplify their voices, their needs, and to support them. Many of the women activists have been actually a pillar of support for many communities inside Saudi Arabia, and it's no longer existed anymore. So yeah, I see that the prospect is very grim, and this is why it's very important to continue the solidarity and support and calling for the release, the full release of people, of the women activists, those who were in prison or those who were released but remain imprisoned in their own country.
Thank you, Hala. Absolutely. I think our interactive discussion will allow us to talk a little bit about what advocacy has been successful in the past, and what are the demands from Saudi society towards the international community to improve the human rights situation. But let me touch upon one last issue before we move on to this interactive discussion, and that is the economic vision 2030, and how that is somehow impacting women. So what provisions of the Vision 2030 address gendered and legal or political reform, or are there any active steps to develop gender parity in the kingdom? How much confidence do you have that Vision 2030 can alleviate legal and social barriers for women's participation in the country? Do you think it will positively improve the life of women and women human rights defenders in the kingdom?
Well, this is very important. One of the hallmark of promoting Saudi leadership, Mohammed bin Salman and his leadership to the international allies, is actually the reforms in women's rights that they actually flag as part of the Vision 2030 for the country. Vision 2030 in text only hinted to some ease of restrictions on women's access to economic opportunities in the workforce. But now Saudi Arabia still remains as scored 148 out of 153 countries in the gender gap index, in the global gender gap index. And the political participation and the economic opportunities and participation very much is at the core of this kind of discrimination. So it doesn't matter if you change the law, if the practice isn't changed. And for the practice to be changed, you need the voices of people. You need the voices of people to change the norm, to set a new trend, to set examples, to see women basically doing all those kinds of uncharted or leading those kinds of uncharted territories. And that is very much missing. If the country is seeing that, if the country at large, the societies, the families are seeing how repressive the government is with women who are advocating for change, how violent they are against these women, how are we expecting that society and families will feel this kind of deterrence, from pursuing violence against their own, female members? This is very much damaging. I don't really discredit, or I don't want to undermine that there are actually positive reforms, but the most positive reforms have come from the demands of the civil society and the women activists. The ease of restrictions on women mobility. Women are able to travel for jobs. Women are able to drive. Women are able to access jobs without being discriminated against or gender segregated from men. Women are able to lead in positions, to be part of decision-making in municipal elections. All are things which are called by women activists who are now being shunned out and marginalized. Other things that I want to highlight is that those kinds of legal reforms would need to be informed by, or basically fed back by, opinions from the people. What is missing? What can be changed? And for that to happen, you need a vital civil society that are able to communicate freely about issues of concern, not to be covered up, as most of the cases of violence that are reported on Twitter, where the government is trying to basically punish those who are reporting it under the cybercrimes law, and instead of really addressing the root causes of violence, the root causes of discrimination. So what I'm saying is that, yes, there are reforms that are happening, but they are piecemeal, fashion reforms in ways that are not really addressing the drastic, basically, discrimination. And this is why we are not really seeing more than 20% of women in the workforce. This is why even with the, inclusion of women in leadership position, you're not really seeing more amplification of the voices of the marginalized, of the voices of women by those women leaders. In fact, women leaders in Saudi Arabia often tend to play the propaganda of the state. So we see the first female ambassador, Rima bint Bandar, for instance, in the US, actually amplifying the state narrative that these women have committed a crime, they violated the law. And instead of supporting these women to pursue these kinds of reform, if it's not for these women, Rima bint Bandar would not be an ambassador, because it's the call of these women that caused the state to be to recognize the role of women and to include more women. So unfortunately, this kind of tokenism doesn't really serve the needs. There is no alternative to actually engage the voices of the women, grassroots level women, and to allow them the freedom to express their opinions in any kinds of reforms enacted. It's very much frightening for me and other women to see that the state is enacting family law, enacting criminal procedural code, in the absence of the voices of civil society that actually might affect how the law is being influencing the society or how it's being framed. I'm very much worried that it will, enforces the values of patriarchal values that is very much prevalent in the court system inside Saudi Arabia. So we do need more of a free society that is reflected by the voices of the women activists.
Thank you very much, Hala, and thanks for raising the point that the reforms imposed from the top down are insufficient and that the Saudi people should be at the center of the reform. And for that, we need an atmosphere in which people have their fundamental rights and liberties to voice their opinion without fear of reprisals. So that being said, I would like to hand back to Julie to get us started on the interactive part of the discussion.
Thank you very much, Julia. First, I would like to address a question to Miss Mary Lawler. As Hala did mention, a couple things are very important to having this type of civil society action to promote their own human rights, and that is an open society. We know that Saudi Arabia is a relatively democratically closed society space. What types of international pressure appear most helpful to improve the situation of human rights defenders in democratically closed societies?
First of all, I want to thank Hala. Hala, I don't know if you remember, but we spoke at a side event some years ago. So, I mean, it's really very difficult because it's the reliance on international solidarity. I mean, we have seen, I suppose, that Saudi has really had its reputation damaged severely over the Khashoggi affair, and then the space for, I suppose, and fair dues to Lena, she mounted the most amazing campaign, but I think that the sustained international pressure on the cases of Lujain and the others, well, if they're not all released, of course, it became very apparent and it created great awareness, and it helped turn Lujain into a household name around the world. And it was like, I suppose, the fact that, originally when the activists started to drive, I mean, that was such a little thing and it was such a novel thing that I think that it caught public imagination in a different kind of a way. But certainly the international pressure has, Saudi hasn't benefited from it at all. And I think that it shows that solidarity with women human rights defenders and international pressure on their behalf, when there is no space for them, as Hala said, all ambassadors anywhere will parrot what their governments say. But the problem for the ambassador in the US is that she has no personal freedom at all to say anything or to question anything. So I would say it's about getting publicity. It's about showing the cruelty of the Saudi government to women human rights defenders. It's about exposing the discrimination against women and women human rights defenders. It's about articulating the laws so clearly as Hala did so wonderfully there, and I took copious notes, Hala, that needs to get out more, because everybody knows Saudi is a country that discriminates against women human rights defenders. There's no question about that. But it's how to translate that into action and solidarity by the international community, and to support in some way those defenders inside who are trying to get information out, and to, I mean, practical stuff like digital security and setting up proxies and all of that kind of stuff. In order to get and communicating in a secure way are all very important tools. I've seen it in other countries which are closed society, where human rights defenders are trying to get information out through a variety of tools that are secure. So that I think would be the first thing. Like, I mean, from the rapporteur's point of view, I'm a bridge between human rights defenders and governments. And so I have actually, you know, I take up cases obviously on Saudi Arabia. But my problem is that because I have the world as the, I have to try and take up cases from human rights defenders all over the world. And in, you know, there's over 193 member states, and at the moment there are 750 human rights defenders sitting in the inbox hoping for some action. So I'm not telling you that just to, and there's only one person doing communications. It's the way we work is we issue letters which are called communications. They're formal communications to governments, and they get 60 days to respond before it's made public. And that's the way the mandate works. So, I mean, I have written 4 since I started in May. And a couple were on Blogger, 2 mails, but on the 2nd of June I did Noof Abdulaziz and Maya Al-Zarani and Samar and Nasima, and of course Lujane. I also contributed in the same way as anyone else contributed. I mean, but I think it's the collective action. You know, it's not just the rapporteur. It's all the civil society groups who are and human rights groups who are working on Saudi Arabia and trying to get media and trying to mount a campaign and get allies. For example, our 2 friends in the European Parliament there. And trying to build alliances and trying to find an entry point, which is and can be difficult with states, you know. So, and I see my own value as being able, perhaps, to engage with states in a way that I wasn't able to do as much of when I was a civil society member, because very often hostile states wouldn't speak to somebody who was from an NGO or civil society. But now, because I have this independent expert appointment, so far everyone is willing to have a meeting with me. So I'm trying to find, when I'm talking to them, you know, is that what do we agree on? What can we move forward on? Is there something, by listening to them, that I can pick up on and use as a way to progress the protection of human rights defenders? And I am taking a people-focused approach to the mandate. I also did a communication about the amendments on the 2017 law on combating crimes of terrorism and its financing, including about practices of extended administrative attention in the so-called correction and and rehabilitation centres. But I think we have to start with an acknowledgement that women human rights defenders all over the world are targeted for who they are and what they do. and the discrimination against them and the attacks against them are gendered in a way that their male colleagues, they suffer the same attacks as their male colleagues, but more because they're women. And I don't really think I can say any more than just keep trying to be persistent. That's another thing, persistent. You know, a lot of people, when they're particularly with long-term cases, and that's why I'm doing it for the report for the General Assembly, there's a flurry of activity in the first year. And maybe every so often on an anniversary or if there's another trial coming up or something like that, an appeal, but then they fade from the sight as they fade from the sight, they fade from your mind. So it's about trying to make sure that you don't let go of these people who should never have been imprisoned, and that you are persistent in trying to raise awareness of their cases. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ms. Lawler. And I think we need that pressure, as you said, by UN experts, politicians around the world, the business community, civil society, and NGOs. And I think what we've seen in the past, that things like the resolution of the European Parliament on the women human rights defenders, communication sent by UN experts, or the common statements by UN member states at the Human Rights Council asking for accountability of the Saudi authorities for human rights violations are paramount in really achieving human rights reform and concessions on the ground. We're slowly nearing the end of the event, but I would just like to pass on again to Hala very briefly to kind of tell us, what do you think we need moving forward, and what do you think has worked well in the past?
Thank you, Julia. Very much I second what Ms. Lawler has mentioned, that women activist targeting is very much gendered. We have seen that the state has actually been using the women position in the family as ways to coerce them and to emphasize that men are expected to control the women. All of the women activists who have been summoned for investigation had their male guardians coming along with them. Some of them have been punished because they were not committed to the pledges that they threatened to restrain the women and their families. Some of them have been placed under travel ban, have been severely interrogated or locked up. All the families of Lajain al-Hajlul has been imprisoned. We've seen also the male guardians have been signing pledges and attending the interrogation with the women. As per reports, some of them have been traumatized, the male, I mean, not only from the society, but from the state, who has been very much asking the men to control the women activists. This is one thing. The other thing I wanted to comment on the structure of the state and why the state is very difficult to penetrate when it comes to adjusting their perception of the role of the women activists or the activists in general. Saudi Arabia is very much heavily, and more so in the last few years after Mohammed bin Salman came to power, an absolute monarchy. The control of Mohammed bin Salman over all the details of the state, all the operation of the state, especially with the Presidency of State Security that overseeing every kinds of security and intelligence apparatus, as well as his control of the economy or the decision-making in the state, is really troubling for us. This is why people in diaspora have been trying very much to come up with ideas to come together, not only to advocate for human rights, but also to advocate for a safe path for democratic transition, respect for the rule of law, and respect for human rights. Last year, on the National Day of Saudi Arabia, a group of most prominent human rights activists, academics, and scholars have in the UK and in Canada, in the US, have established the National Assembly Party. This is the first party to be established in diaspora in terms of advocating for more of a democratic transition, something that will protect the rule of law, that will envision a new democratic path to Saudi Arabia. This is not very much a new idea. We have seen that the international allies of Saudi Arabia, of other countries, of other autocratic countries, have actually demanded democratic change from their partners. This happened in Kuwait after the invasion of Iraq. The French have actually questioned their involvement in the capturing of the Iraqi occupiers and the return of Kuwait to al-Sabah family, based on the condition, they actually questioned, why should we support Kuwait autocratic leaders? And then there was a negotiation of some kinds of balances and checks being imposed on the position of the king or the emir at the time. There was a demand to establish a constitutional monarchy at the time, and that happened. Though the Kuwaiti parliament is very much less functional than any kind of democratic country, but the safety of people and the rule of law is far much protected than that of Saudi Arabia. So to demand from the international allies through the Saudi civil society to have some kinds of accountability, some kinds of balances and checks being enforced, whether it's in terms of enforcing the idea of an action plan for a democratic path in a constitutional monarchy, or basically a representation of the people, more representation of the people, and therefore more protection for the civil society from being persecuted in such an aggressive way. This is very much within the leverage, within the capacity of Saudi Arabia international allies in the EU or US or Canada.
Thank you very much, Hala and Ms. Lawler, for this enthralling discussion. ECDHR and ALCUST would like to share a series of recommendations with the EU representatives present here today before we bring this event to an end. The EU Action Plan on Human Rights and Democracy, released last year, emphasizes promoting and empowering individuals from a gendered perspective. In particular, it highlights the need to use all tools at the EU's disposal to call for fair trials of human rights defenders across the world, issue public statements condemning human rights violations, and work towards a worldwide abolition of the death penalty, which is actively practiced in Saudi Arabia. We also call for the scheduling of a date for the formal human rights dialogue between the EAS and Human Rights Commission in Saudi Arabia, allowing the EU representation to be briefed about the systematic persecution of women's rights defenders in the kingdom. Further, we ask that human rights be placed at the forefront of any economic trade or other arrangements between the European community and Saudi Arabia, as outlined in the EU Action Plan of Human Rights and Democracy. ECDHR and ALCUST have drafted a letter to the EAS which highlights the dire situation of women's rights defenders in Saudi Arabia and urges the Commission to raise this issue in their human rights dialogue with the kingdom. We encourage MEPs to co-sign this letter as a way to ensure that the EU upholds its human rights obligations in its external relations. This brings us to the end of the panel. Firstly, we would like to thank MEP Helmut Scholz and Alessandra Moretti for collaborating with us in the organization of this event and for their introductory remarks. We also would like to thank our panelists, Ms. Mary Lawler and Hala Al-Dusari, for taking the time out of their busy schedules in order to have this timely discussion on International Women's Day. And finally, thank you to everyone here today for taking the time to join the conversation. Have a nice rest of the week. Bye.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.